A growing sense of urgency around severe weather events and rising sea levels has set a new course for architecture's relationship with flood. These complex obstacles require robust and adaptive responses architecturally, necessitating a complete rethink of how we plan to rebuild a township at the confluence of three rivers. This thesis project speculates a long-term strategy for flood accommodating architecture. The architecture stands as a protest and counter-argument in a satirical way, but also a meaningful exercise into ideas about flood resilience, placemaking, and the legacy of construction. It begins with the words of resident Kate Stroud. For me, the sound of rain has changed, as it has for many in the northern rivers, from a peaceful backdrop for slumber to a warning sign not to get complacent. The sound carries with it a weight of the power that can hide behind it. I've seen water in places that the mind can't fathom. House after house, sky high on stilts, silent, open, and gaping, revealing the holes that have been left in so many lives. Empty shells waiting for answers and a bureaucratic process to filter down to those who are still living in tents beneath the bare bones of their homes. The brief for this project was designed in July of 2022 after visiting the site post-flood and listening to personal stories like these from residents across the floodplain who, despite harrowing accounts, pledged to remain and build back better in the country they call home. The landscape holds immense value for both humans and non-humans alike, but a lack of exchange between these ecologies have left the landscape battered and more susceptible to flood. An adaptive rather than reactive architectural approach is needed that addresses the transient nature of climate and country, treating the built and natural environment in mutually beneficial ways. Urban planning in Lismore currently turns its back on the river. Physical barriers like the Lismore levee divide the community and river as manifestations of a greater fear of potential waters that can reach up to 14.4 metres. Broad stroke solutions by government have created contention within the township, forcefully blocking and relocating the travel of water. There is a need for community-led solutions that embed layers of resilience into architecture, adapting and responding to flood at multiple scales over time. This project thus aims to address these symptoms of division, empowering an already skilled community to take action into their own hands, offering a seat at the table, designing and prototyping solutions at scale. A series of interviews, stories, visions for the future, and analysis of existing building stock are gathered, illustrating the failure of existing policy and flood-proof infrastructure in the countless decommissioned structures within Lismore. Existing consultation through message boards and council meetings were found to be disparate, lacking a collective and cohesive method to adapt with flood, and instead perpetuated lackluster reactionary solutions by those who haven't experienced flood firsthand. In response to these concerns, a group of like-minded Lismore residents joined forces to create an interdisciplinary flood union, a cooperative of community voices interviewed by the designer who act as protagonists for the proposal, championing change and co-designing the future of the riverine township. The site of the vacant Kirkland Street car park is chosen along the river's edge in an attempt to reactivate and break down barriers to the existing riverfront. The first act of the union entails the design of a table for community discussion and exchange of interdisciplinary solutions, addressing the need for a central point of governance around flood management in the CBD. Interventions by the union are imagined as a kit of parts expanding from the construction of the table. The site becomes a work-in-progress excavation site for flood-resilient prototyping. The exchange proposal is introduced as a semi-permanent fixture within the town. It houses the research, politics, and production necessary to retrofit existing buildings, putting flood resilience at the forefront of the region. As a space to prototype, the site becomes a worked example of flood accommodating architecture, whilst also reflecting a desire to accommodate community action and flood research by action groups like the Indigenous Hazards Trust and the New Northern Rivers Reconstruction Authority. By reconstructing the river riparian zone, a gradient of resilient infrastructure and landscape is introduced that captures, dispels, and accommodates water, layering degrees of resilience within the architecture in response to fluctuating flood levels. Community-led reconstruction is encouraged, channeling the existing excavation industry within Lismore. By extracting silt and improving the permeability of soils, river health is not only prioritised, but the capacity to absorb floodwaters increase. Prototype satellites deployed along the river collect silt for reuse as permeable tiles, replacing hardscape within the region. In the later stages of the proposal, the knowledge gained from the prototype exchange serves to extend the flood resilient practices past the domestic scale and permeates through to urban and regional scales. A toolbox of flood design principles gathered via rigorous research and prototyping helps to form a guide for living and retrofitting existing infrastructure, admitting no single measure will reduce flood risk. The master plan emphasizes the need for a layered approach. Major floodplains at the forefront of the flood are migrated via buybacks for those who wish to move. The aim is to restore floodplain land to wetlands and reservoirs that store water, whilst also introducing green corridors of vacant land to accommodate and absorb water. The exchange contains the beginnings of these architectural seeds to plant across the master plan. It becomes a beacon connecting and working with the riverfront and community during normal conditions, whilst also switching to disaster relief mode during flood. Amphibious principles are implemented in the design via safe boxes within the building envelope, activated as flood rises to maintain essential circulation paths and storage. This short section illustrates the strategy of the design, a recontoured shoreline implementing the flood principles. Water is accommodated, dispelled, and stored in response to the fluctuation of rainfall and flood. The upper ground contains a central forum and a multi-purpose hall where the union conducts dry research and production. The forum houses space for the negotiation of the future township, the union meeting here to instigate change. The interdisciplinary collaboration corridor is a spill-out zone where flood research can cross-pollinate. The labs are working spaces supporting the repair of the river ecosystem, silt extraction, and tile production. These spaces become safe storage when flood warnings are called, all essential equipment being stored here until the flood waters subside. The lower ground plane is carved out into 3 plazas that reactivate the riverfront, designed as inundation zones where water is accommodated with fluctuating river levels, delaying its entry into the river. A layered and stepped exchange proposal aims to operate at varying levels of flood. In instances of heavy rain, water rise is captured in the inundation zone. During cloudbursts, plazas act as ponds and reservoirs, storing excess water within the scheme. In 1 in 100 year and 1 in 500 year events, safe boxes in the forum rise to become havens and disaster relief points for the union at the center of the master plan, where boats dock for rescue efforts. Weather patterns and forecasters predict flood disasters are looming and increasing as an indefinite prospect in the future, not just in Lismore, but closer to home in the Hawke's European. The project aims to display a growing desire that exists for a space to negotiate and prototype principles that are not just resilient to flood, but adapt with it, hearing community voices and embedding layers of resilience into architecture.